My name is Sloane Whitmore. I'm 34 years old. I was on a ventilator for 11 hours. When I came off it, the first thing I did was ask the ICU nurse if my parents had called. She looked at me the way people look at you when they don't want to be the one to say the thing. Then she handed me my phone from the side table and pointed at the charging cord. There were 42 text messages. None of them were from my mother. None of them were from my father. There was one from my brother Connor, sent at 11:47 that morning. Heard you're in the hospital. Hope you're okay. Tea time at noon. Talk soon. That was it. That was the full extent of what my family gave me when I was in an intensive care unit with a machine breathing for me. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 weeks before that morning, I had walked into the offices of Hargrove and Pelletier, the trust administration firm that had managed our family's finances for 12 years, and I had signed a single document that froze every disbursement from the Whitmore Family Trust. All $5,400,000 of it, every transfer, every scheduled payment, including the $2,600 per month that covered my parents' mortgage on the house they lived in for 19 years and could not afford on their own. That payment stopped on a Tuesday. They found out about it on a Friday. I was already home from the hospital by then, eating soup I had made myself, with the television on low, completely alone and completely at peace. This is that story. Before we go any further, I want to know where in the world you are right now. What city? What country? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I am always amazed by how far these stories travel, and I find something deeply comforting about knowing that someone in Edinburgh or Singapore or Cape Town is sitting with this right now at whatever hour it is, maybe recognizing something in this story that they've lived themselves. If you connect with stories about women who were treated as afterthoughts and quietly built something those people could never touch, please subscribe and leave a like. It takes 1 second, and it genuinely helps this channel reach the women who need it most. Now let me take you back, not to the hospital, to the house I grew up in. The Whitmore family lived at 14 Aldercrest Drive in Westover, Connecticut, a suburb so aggressively pleasant that even the arguments happened in hushed tones. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a koi pond my father installed the summer he decided he was the kind of man who had a koi pond. My father, Richard Whitmore, was 61 at the time of the golf tournament. He had worked for 22 years as a regional sales director for a packaging manufacturer, then retired at 58 because he said the commute was killing him, and my mother agreed. He had a handicap of 9 and was deeply, sincerely convinced that this made him interesting at parties. My mother, Judith, was 58. She had been, at various points in her life, a dental hygienist, a part-time real estate agent, and a full-time manager of the family's social calendar. She organized charity luncheons, volunteered at the hospital auxiliary, not on the floors, at the gift shop, and had opinions about catering that she shared freely and often. My brother Connor was 31. He was, by the family's official accounting, the gifted one. Connor had the kind of easy charm that gets mistaken for capability in families where nobody is paying close enough attention. He played golf at a near-competitive level, which my father treated as a moral achievement. He had worked in financial sales for 4 years, left to start a sports equipment import business that never quite found its footing, and was, at the time of my hospitalization, technically employed as a quote, consultant for a company that had not yet officially launched. His apartment in Hartford was paid for by the family trust. His car lease was paid for by the family trust. A $6,000 golf club fitting he had done in Scottsdale the previous April was paid for by the family trust. I know this because I was, for all practical purposes, the person who managed the trust. That is where I should explain what the Whitmore Family Trust actually was, because the way my family talked about it and the way it actually functioned were 2 entirely different things. My maternal grandfather, Harold Cresswell, had built a successful chain of hardware stores across southern New England over 40 years. When he died in 2011, he left behind an estate valued at approximately $8 million. Half went to charitable foundations he had designated in his will. The remaining half went into a trust for his daughter's family, my family. The trust was structured so that it would make regular disbursements to cover family living expenses, with the principal invested to sustain those payouts for decades. Harold was meticulous and deeply decent. He had asked for a co-trustee structure. The trust administration firm, Hargrove and Pelletier, would handle the financial mechanics, but a named family co-trustee would have signature authority over any changes to disbursement schedules. When Harold set up the trust, he named my mother as the family co-trustee. That was the original arrangement. Then, 5 years ago, my mother had a health scare, a cardiac event, not severe, but enough to shake her. She had decided that the administrative responsibilities of co-trusteeship were too stressful and had formally petitioned to transfer her co-trustee role. She had asked Connor to take it on. Connor had looked at the paperwork involved and declined within 48 hours. Then, she had asked me. I said yes. I always said yes. I spent 2 months working with Hargrove and Pelletier to understand the full structure of the trust. I reviewed the investment allocations, the disbursement schedule, the provisions, the fee structure. What I found was that the trust had been running significantly above its sustainable disbursement rate for several years. Connor's lifestyle expenses alone were drawing $112,000 a year from the principal. My parents' mortgage payment, their supplemental health insurance, the property taxes on Aldercrest Drive, the annual maintenance on 2 vehicles, all of it came through the trust. The total annual disbursement was running at $238,000. The sustainable rate, according to the trust's investment advisor, was closer to $160,000. At the current rate, the trust would be functionally depleted in under 11 years. I brought this to my parents at a Sunday dinner in September of that year. I had a printed summary, organized by disbursement category, with projections at 3 different spending rates. My father looked at the first page, nodded slowly, and said, "Well, Harold always said the trust was there for the family." My mother poured more wine and said, "Sloane, you know Connor is going through a transition. This isn't the time." Connor wasn't at dinner. He was at a golf weekend in Vermont that the trust had covered at a cost of $2,300. I gathered my papers, thanked them for dinner, and drove home. That was the first time I understood that my role as co-trustee was not to protect the trust. It was to administer it quietly and never inconvenience anyone with the truth. I need to tell you about the way my family had always allocated their affection, because it mattered to everything that came later. From the time I was old enough to understand the structure of our household, the order was clear. Connor was the son. I was the person who made sure the utilities were paid so the lights stayed on around him. When Connor was 12 and I was 15, he started showing promise in junior golf. My father began waking at 5:30 on Saturdays to drive him to tournaments. I started taking the city bus to my Saturday debate team practices because the car was with Connor. When Connor was accepted to a mid-tier university on a partial golf scholarship, my parents threw a party for 26 people. When I was accepted to the University of Connecticut School of Business, with a merit scholarship that covered 70% of my tuition, my mother said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," and went back to addressing Connor's party invitations. I paid for the remaining 30% of my tuition through a combination of part-time work and a federal loan I finished paying off at 29. I want to be clear. My parents never said they didn't love me. They never said I didn't matter. What they did was something quieter, and in some ways, harder to articulate. They consistently, reflexively, without apparent awareness, chose Connor first. Every time there was a finite resource, attention, money, the car on a Saturday, the good seats at the table, the calculation was made before anyone asked. Connor got what he needed. I got what was left. For most of my life, I accepted this as simply the weather of my family, the way things were. Not ideal, but not worth fighting. I was, as my father often said, the capable one, the self-sufficient one. I took that as a compliment for longer than I should have. The specific incident that broke something in me was not dramatic. It did not involve shouting or a scene. It happened at Christmas 2 years before the hospitalization. I had driven down from my apartment in New Haven, a 2-hour drive in traffic, arriving with groceries and a bag of gifts. Connor arrived the following afternoon, 2 days before Christmas, empty-handed and cheerful, with a story about a business meeting that had run long. That evening, my father poured 2 glasses of scotch, handed one to Connor, and they sat in the study discussing Connor's brand consulting opportunity for 40 minutes, while I peeled potatoes in the kitchen with my mother. At dinner, my father made a toast. He talked about the family, about the year ahead, about Connor's promising venture. Then he looked at me across the table and said, "Sloane, you've always been our rock. We don't have to worry about you." He meant it kindly. He genuinely, completely meant it kindly. But I heard what it actually meant. "I don't have to pay attention to you. You don't require anything from me. You are a solved problem." I smiled. I raised my glass. I drove home the next morning. Over the following year, I watched the trust continue to fund Connor's lifestyle at a rate that troubled me professionally and exhausted me personally. I raised the sustainability issue twice more, once in an email that went unanswered for 9 days, and once on a phone call with my mother that ended with her saying, "Sloane, your grandfather would not have wanted us to live like we were penny pinching." I also raised the question of whether the trust should be audited for tax efficiency. My father's response was that Hargrove and Pelletier were handling everything just fine, and he didn't understand why I was trying to stir things up. I stopped stirring. I started preparing. In January, I enrolled in a continuing education course in trust and estate law at a Hartford area law school. I had an accounting background. I worked as a financial analyst for a regional hospital network, but I wanted to understand the legal mechanisms of what I was managing with more precision than I currently had. Over 8 weeks of evening classes, I learned things about the Whitmore Family Trust that I had not fully grasped before. The first was that as co-trustee, I had the unilateral authority to initiate a temporary disbursement freeze on grounds of fiscal responsibility review. This was a standard protective provision. It required written notice to Hargrove and Pelletier, a statement of grounds, and a 30-day review window. During that window, no disbursements would leave the trust without dual sign-off. Since Connor had declined the co-trustee role and my mother had formally ceded it, dual sign-off meant me and the firm's representative. The second thing I learned was that Harold Cresswell had included a sunset provision in the trust. If the principal fell below $1 million, the trust would dissolve and the remaining assets would be distributed equally between named heirs. At current disbursement rates, the trust would hit that threshold in approximately 9 years. I was one of the named heirs. I had never been told this. My parents had apparently never thought to mention it. I didn't act on any of this immediately. I sat with it. I read the trust documents again, slowly, from the beginning, the way I should have done the first time. I made notes. I spoke with a private estate attorney, a woman named Carla Mendez, who confirmed my reading of the co-trustee provisions and added one observation that stayed with me. She said, quote, "A freeze initiated for documented fiscal reasons is legally bulletproof. The question is whether you're prepared for what the conversation looks like on the other side of it." I told her I was not planning to have a conversation. She looked at me for a moment and said, "That's your right." I scheduled a meeting with Hargrove and Pelletier for the second Tuesday of February. I brought Carla Mendez. I brought a 12-page fiscal review document I had prepared over 6 weeks, detailing the disbursement overage, the principal erosion trajectory, and the projected depletion timeline. I also brought a formal written notice of temporary disbursement freeze, signed, dated, and citing the trust's protective provisions by section and subsection. The firm's representative, a senior administrator named Owen Chesley, read through everything carefully. He asked 4 questions, all of which I answered with documentation. Then he signed the acknowledgement form and said the freeze would take effect in 48 hours. He noted that standard notice would be sent to all trust beneficiaries by certified mail, as required by the trust document. I said that was perfectly appropriate. I drove home, made dinner, and did not tell anyone in my family what I had done. 8 days later, on a Thursday morning at 6:41, I woke up and could not breathe. It had started as what I thought was a chest cold, 3 days of fatigue, a low fever, a cough that felt deeper than usual. I had gone to a walk-in clinic 2 days earlier and been told it was likely viral. I went home, took ibuprofen, drank fluids, worked from my kitchen table in the afternoon. Then Thursday morning, I woke up and my chest was concrete. Every breath was a negotiation. I called 911 at 6:43. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. By the time I reached Yale New Haven Hospital, my oxygen saturation was at 81%. I had bilateral pneumonia that had progressed faster than the initial assessment had caught. I was moved to the ICU and placed on a ventilator by 9:27 that morning. I was not aware of any of this happening. I was unconscious. The hospital contacted my emergency contact. My emergency contact was my mother. Judith Whitmore received a call at 9:51 that morning, informing her that her daughter had been admitted to the ICU and was on ventilatory support. That same morning, Connor was playing in a club invitational tournament at a golf course in Farmington. It was a 2-day event he had been registered for since October. My parents had planned to come watch. When my mother received the hospital's call, she called my father. According to what my Aunt Patricia told me weeks later, my mother and father discussed it for several minutes. Connor was already at the first tee. The hospital had said I was stable on the ventilator, which meant, as my father apparently reasoned, that there was nothing for them to do at the hospital that they couldn't do later. Connor's tournament was that day. They would go to Farmington, watch Connor play through the morning round, and then drive to New Haven. They watched the morning round. They had lunch at the clubhouse. They watched the early afternoon play. They arrived at the hospital at 3:48, approximately 6 hours after I had been admitted, at which point I was being weaned off the ventilator and had been told by the attending physician that I had come in at a level of hypoxia that was genuinely dangerous. They stayed for 51 minutes. My father patted my hand. My mother said I should have gone back to the doctor sooner. Connor texted, "If you're still watching, and if any part of this is striking something real in you, something you've felt in your own family, I want you to drop a comment right now. Just say I see you, or tell me what part hit hardest. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. These stories take real work to bring to you every day, and every subscriber is what makes that possible." I was discharged on Saturday morning. I went home alone. I did not call my parents when I was discharged. I did not tell them I was home. I ate soup from a can because I had not gone to the grocery store in 12 days. I slept for 14 hours. On Sunday morning, I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table in the quiet, and looked at the 42 text messages on my phone. I read each of them carefully. Cousins, a college friend, 2 work colleagues, my Aunt Patricia, my neighbor who had seen the ambulance. Nothing from my father. One text from my mother, sent at 9:59 on the morning I was admitted. "Sloane, we heard you're in the hospital. Your father and I are going to come later today. Rest and we'll see you." That was the first and only direct communication from either of my parents during my entire hospitalization. Later that day turned out to be almost 7 hours after the fact. I read that text several times. Then I set the phone down and drank my coffee and felt something settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the pneumonia. I called Carla Mendez on Monday morning. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "How are you feeling physically?" I told her I was on antibiotics and would need 2 weeks of recovery before returning to work. She said, "And emotionally?" I told her I was clear. I told her I was done. She said, "Then let's talk about what comes next." What came next took 2 months and required a level of focused, deliberate patience that I think only becomes available to you after you've decided that you have nothing left to lose by telling the truth. The disbursement freeze was already in place. The certified notice letters from Hargrove and Pelletier had gone out to my parents and Connor 8 days prior, which meant they had received those letters while I was in the ICU. Carla confirmed that my parents had called Hargrove and Pelletier the day after the letters arrived, the very day I was being discharged from the hospital, to ask what was happening with the trust payments. Owen Chesley had informed them that a fiscal review had been initiated by the co-trustee and that disbursements were paused pending review. He had given them the timeline. He had not given them my name as the initiating party, because the process document did not require him to. They did not yet know it was me. I spent the first week of my recovery building the document. Carla called it the Fiscal Review Report, which was its official designation. I thought of it as something closer to an accounting of the truth. It was 47 pages. It covered everything. The disbursement history by category for the past 5 years, the principal erosion chart, the projected depletion timeline under 3 scenarios, the sustainability analysis, and a proposed restructured disbursement schedule that would extend the trust's life to a minimum of 30 additional years. The proposed schedule reduced Connor's trust-funded lifestyle expenses by 68%. It maintained my parents' mortgage payment at its current level for 3 additional years, after which it would taper as a reflection of what the trust could genuinely sustain. It was not punitive. It was mathematical. It was what Harold Cresswell would have wanted if anyone had been honest with him about how his trust was being used. Carla reviewed every page. She said it was rigorous, and she said it was defensible. She also said, gently, "You know this is going to be received as an attack." I told her I knew. I told her that the alternative was watching the trust dissolve in 9 years, and my parents lose their mortgage payment with no warning and no plan. She nodded and said, "Sometimes the most caring thing looks like cruelty from the outside." I told her that was also fine. I was past needing it to look kind. During the second week of my recovery, I drove to Aldercrest Drive on a Wednesday afternoon. It was the first time I had seen my parents since the 51-minute hospital visit. My mother opened the door. She looked at me with an expression that I had spent my whole life trying to read. It was somewhere between relief and inconvenience, as if my presence resolved a worry but also created one. My father was in the study. He came out when he heard my voice. He shook my hand, which was the physical gesture my father used when he was managing his emotions. He said I looked better. I said I felt better. We sat at the kitchen table. I had not brought the documents. I had not brought Carla. I had come to look at them and say one thing. I said, "I want you to know that I was alone in the ICU. I was on a ventilator, and you went to watch Connor golf." My father said, "Sloane, you were stable. The doctor said you were stable." My mother said, "We came that same day. We were there." I said, "You came 6 hours later, and you stayed less than an hour." My father said, "This is not fair. We were in a difficult position." I looked at him for a long time. Then I said, "I know. So was I." I stood up, thanked them for the tea I had not touched, and drove back to New Haven. I did not hear from either of them for 11 days. On the 12th day, Hargrove and Pelletier convened the formal fiscal review meeting. It was held at their offices in downtown Hartford. My parents attended with a family friend who sometimes gave them informal legal advice, a retired contracts attorney named Bill Forsyth, who had no expertise in trust law. Connor attended by phone from what sounded from the background noise, like a restaurant. Carla Mendez attended as my counsel. I attended as the co-trustee. Owen Chesley opened the meeting by stating that the purpose was to review the fiscal findings and consider proposed adjustments to the disbursement schedule. He noted that the review had been initiated by the co-trustee under the trust's protective provisions and that the findings were documented and available for review. He distributed the 47-page report. My father opened it, read the first 2 pages, and looked up at me. It was the first time in my adult life that I had seen my father look at me without the particular softness of paternal certainty, without the expression that said, "Whatever this is, I know how it ends." He looked uncertain. He looked, for just a moment, like he was genuinely seeing me. Then Bill Forsyth said, "Now what exactly is the legal basis for this freeze? Who authorized a co-trustee to unilaterally halt disbursements?" Carla cited the section and subsection without looking at her notes. Bill said, "This seems like an extreme measure." Carla said, "It is a standard protective provision. The trust includes it precisely for situations of fiscal review." My mother said, "Sloane, why didn't you talk to us first?" I said, "I did, 3 times over 2 years, including with a printed summary that Dad read 2 pages of." My father said nothing. My mother said, "That's not fair." I said, "Page 7 of the report shows the disbursement figures. Pages 12 through 19 show the sustainability projections. The math is not a matter of fairness." Connor spoke for the first time from the phone speaker on the conference table. He said, "I don't understand why my expenses are being singled out." I said, "Connor, your expenses represent 47% of the trust's annual disbursements. You are 31 years old. The trust was not designed to fund your life indefinitely." Connor said, "Grandpa Harold would have wanted to support the family." I said, "Grandpa Harold built his stores from scratch over 40 years. I think he would have found this deeply uncomfortable." Connor went quiet. My father said, "What does this mean for the mortgage?" I said, "The mortgage payment will continue at its current level for 3 additional years while you make a plan. After that, it tapers on a schedule that Carla can walk you through." My mother's eyes filled. She said, "We cannot afford that house without the trust." I said, "I know. That is why the taper is graduated and why I have included 3 years of lead time. The report on page 31 includes a financial planning resource list." My father looked at the table. He said, "Connor should have more time to get his business going." I said Connor's business expenses are not in the revised schedule. His living expenses, rent, car, personal spending, are reduced to $30,000 annually, which is what the trust can sustain for a secondary beneficiary while maintaining principal. Connor's voice from the speaker, "That's not enough to." I said, "Connor, that is more than I have ever received from this trust in any year, including the years I managed it." The room was very quiet. Owen Chesley looked at both sides of the table and said, measured and professional, "The proposed schedule is within the co-trustee's authority to implement. The fiscal review documentation is complete and legally sufficient. I would recommend the family review the full report and consult with independent counsel before the follow-up meeting in 2 weeks." Bill Forsythe put down his pen and looked at Carla and then at me, with an expression that was not quite respect but was close to it. My mother was crying without making noise, the way she always cried, and my father was staring at page 7 of the report with the focused attention he had never given my Christmas dinner summary 2 years before. I thanked Owen. I thanked Bill for attending. I said goodbye to my parents and told them Carla would be available for any procedural questions. I did not say goodbye to Connor. I walked out of Hargrove and Pelletier's offices at 2:44 in the afternoon, into gray November air, and stood on the sidewalk and took a breath that went all the way down, the first fully clear breath I could remember taking in a very long time. The aftermath arrived in stages, as it always does. My mother called the evening after the meeting. Her voice was the one she used when she had been crying and was trying to sound like she hadn't. She said, "Sloane, I need you to understand that we didn't know the trust was in trouble." I said, "I know you didn't know. That is why I tried to tell you." She said, "We should have listened." That was it. 4 words that cost her something. I held them. I said, "Yes." She cried again, quietly. I said, "The mortgage payment is not stopping tomorrow. You have 3 years. Use them." She said, "I don't know how to tell Connor." I said, "That's between you and Dad." She was quiet. Then she said, "I should have come to the hospital." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know, and I meant it." Not as a forgiving, tidy ending to the story, but as the honest truth. I believe she was sorry, and I also knew that sorry is not the same as changed, and that what I needed was not her apology, but my own clarity. My father did not call. He appeared at my apartment on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later, unannounced, which was so unlike him that I looked past his shoulder when I opened the door to see if someone had brought him. He was alone. He was holding a paper bag from a diner near his house, 2 cups of coffee, and what turned out to be cranberry scone, which he apparently remembered was something I liked from a breakfast we had shared years ago. He did not apologize in words. He sat at my kitchen table and looked at his coffee for a long time and then said, "Your grandfather would have been proud of you for doing this." I should have been paying attention. It was not a full accounting. It was not everything I had needed for 34 years. But it was the most honest thing my father had ever said to me, and I counted it. Connor sent a 3-paragraph email that was, in structure and tone, a negotiation. He acknowledged that the trust had been running high, expressed that the new schedule would require significant lifestyle adjustments, and asked whether a temporary bridge payment could be arranged while his business gained traction. I forwarded it to Carla, who responded on my behalf, explaining the procedural channels available to him. I did not respond personally. I did not feel the need to. Aunt Patricia took me to lunch in December. She had always been my mother's more observant sister, the one who watched and cataloged and rarely said anything until she did. She ordered soup and looked at me across the table and said, "You know that your grandfather specifically asked your mother to make sure you were provided for, not just Connor. You." I set down my spoon. "He said that?" She nodded. "He said it more than once. He was worried your parents would forget to see you." I thought about Harold Cresswell, who I had known only as a serious man with large hands and a belief that things should be done right, who had set up a trust that included a provision to protect it, who had made sure I had co-trustee authority through my mother, in a chain that neither of us had fully understood at the time. Maybe he had. Maybe it was deliberate. I would never know for certain, but I held it anyway. "I want to speak to you for a moment. If you are the capable one in your family, the self-sufficient one, the one they don't worry about because you always handle it, I want you to hear this. There is a difference between being trusted and being overlooked, between being relied on and being taken for granted. The fact that you do not make noise does not mean your needs do not exist. It does not mean the accounting is fair. And you are allowed to say so. You are allowed to do more than say so. You are allowed to act on the truth that you have been quietly carrying alone, even when doing so feels like a betrayal of something, even when the people who are affected did not mean to create the problem they created. Intentions are not the same as consequences. You are allowed to respond to consequences. The trust restructuring was fully implemented in March. Connor moved out of his Hartford apartment and in with a friend from college while he reconsidered his options. The last I heard, he had taken a position with a golf equipment retailer, which struck me as possibly the most honest thing he had ever done. My parents listed the house on Aldercrest Drive in April, not because they had to, but because they sat down with a financial planner, as I had suggested, and decided that simplifying made more sense than spending 3 years of buffer time trying to maintain a life they couldn't afford. They found a smaller place in a town 20 minutes away, with a garden, which my mother actually seemed to prefer. She texted me a photograph of it with no caption. Just the image. I texted back a single heart emoji. It was the best exchange we had managed in years. I went back to work in March, to the hospital network, where I had spent 6 years building a career that my family had never quite been able to name when asked what I did. I told my department head what had happened, the pneumonia, the ICU, the recovery, in the same factual way I would have described a project timeline. She listened and then said, "Take whatever time you need." I didn't need more time. I needed to be back. I needed to be in a room where my work was legible, where the output was measurable, where I was seen for what I actually did and not defined by the space that remained after everyone else was accounted for. On a Sunday in April, I drove out to the cemetery where Harold Cresswell was buried. I had been once before, at the funeral, which I barely remembered. It was a clear day, cold still, with the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been recently washed. I stood at the headstone for a while. I did not say anything out loud. I thought about what Aunt Patricia had told me. I thought about the trust document, which I had now read so many times I could navigate it from memory. I thought about the koi pond at Aldercrest Drive, which my parents had already drained because the new house did not have a spot for it. I thought about 34 years of peeling potatoes in the kitchen while someone else was in the study. And I thought about 11 hours on a ventilator, and 42 text messages, and a scone that arrived 3 weeks late on a Saturday morning. There are stories that end in dramatic confrontations, raised voices, public scenes. Mine ended in a conference room in Hartford with 47 pages of documented truth and an administrator saying, "The findings are legally sufficient." It was quiet. It was unglamorous. It was the most powerful thing I have ever done. I am not going to tell you that my family is fixed. Families are not problems that get fixed. They are systems that shift and resettle after enough force is applied, and what you get on the other side is something different from what you had, which is not the same as better. My mother calls every Sunday. My father is building a raised garden bed at the new house and sent me a photograph of the foundation lumber, which I chose to interpret as an olive branch in the language of a man who does not know how to say what he means. Connor and I do not talk, which is the honest equilibrium. He knows where to find me when he is ready for honesty. I will not go looking. If someone in your life has been invisible to you, if there is a person who has handled things quietly while you looked elsewhere, who has managed and maintained and shown up without fanfare while you reserved your attention for someone louder, I want to ask you, when is the last time you made sure they were okay without needing something from them? When is the last time you called just to call? And if you are the one who has been invisible, what would it look like to stop managing quietly and start naming the truth? Not in anger, not in a scene, just in the clear, documented, irrefutable language of what actually happened. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you, genuinely, for spending this time with Sloane's story and with this channel. We know you have 1,000 things competing for your attention, and the fact that you stayed all the way through this one means more than I can say. If something in this story echoed something you've been carrying, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. The Revenge Diary community in the comments is one of the most thoughtful, honest spaces I've seen online, and every time you leave a comment or share a story, You're part of building that. New episodes every single day. Subscribe so the algorithm knows to bring you the next one. We'll be here